Hey everyone, Benchy here from Benching&Gaming. Today I've managed to get my hands on this, the GTX 480, specifically the EVGA superclocked version released on April 7th, 2010. Now, on its release, the GTX 480 was the fastest single GPU card you could buy, and due to just how hot it ran, it managed to earn itself the nickname flamethr. So I'm sure you can imagine just how hot it gets if you don't already know. But going into this video, I knew about its reputation for how hot it ran, but honestly, I didn't realise just how bad it was. That's worrying. Suppose I better get on with the video so I can deal with that. The version of the 480 we have here today, which required one 6-pin and one 8-pin PCIe power connector, is the superclocked version from EVGA, which is basically the same as the standard GTX 480, just with slightly higher core and memory clocks, and an equal TDP of 250 watts. On launch, the 480 would have set you back at least $499 US, which seemed a relatively small amount compared to today's highest end cards. This being the superclocked version though, would have cost you a bit more at $529 US on launch, which is around $622 US today, or around £507 or 554 euros. 9 years on though, I managed to pick this one up for only £20 at CEX in the UK, a bargain for something that offers support for up to DirectX 12, albeit a cut down version of it. It's out of stock at CEX just now though, but on eBay UK you'd end up paying around £25 for the cheapest one, and in the US it will set you back around $37 US at the time of writing. As the name suggests, the GTX 480 came with 480 shading units, which was actually cut down from the full 512 SUs of the full Fermi chip, which to be honest is probably a good thing considering the heat this thing chucks out. That aside, let's delve a bit deeper into the specs of the GTX 480. Based on the Fermi architecture, the 480 featured 3.1 billion transistors built on the 40nm fabrication process. It ran at 726 MHz on the core, 26 MHz up from the standard model, and had a shader clock of 1451 MHz, which is always double whatever the core runs at. There was also 1536 MB of GDDR5 memory on a 384-bit bus, running at 950 MHz, 3800 MHz effectively due to the nature of GDDR5. The 480's die itself featured 15 shading multiprocessors, the aforementioned 480 shading units, 60 texture mapping units, and 48 raster operations pipelines. The die also has 64 KB of L1 cache per SM and 768 KB of L2 cache. For the test today, I've locked the fan speed at a noticeably audible 70% for all of the games apart from Warframe, in which I set the fan to a more uncomfortably loud 80% as I wasn't particularly happy with the temperature it was getting to in that game. The rest of the system I'll be using for the duration of the benchmark today features an i7 6700K at 4.7 GHz on an MSI Z270 SLI Plus motherboard with 16GB of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 at 2800 MHz, and Windows 10 Pro 64-bit, with the games running from a mechanical hard drive separate from the OS. First up was going to be GTA 5, and I say was, implying that it didn't exactly go well. I'm unsure of what the issues were, but no matter what I did, the game would keep crashing to the desktop. It wasn't temperature related, as the same issue occurred at 100% fan speed, and the other games didn't have these issues at all, so unfortunately I had to abandon any attempts at benchmarking the game. That aside though, performance was actually pretty decent. The 480 at 1080p could manage a mix of ultra, very high and high settings, which I'll put down in the description below. I also used these settings when I tried 720p too. There was no noticeable stuttering or locking up throughout the city, and FPS dropped no lower than 39 and got into the high 40s at 1080p, with 720p managing highs into the mid 80s here. Fantastic performance for a 9-year-old card. There wasn't any input lag or locking either. Hoping for something that actually works, it's time to move on to Rise of the Tomb Raider, the second game in the rebooted Tomb Raider series. I'm running both resolutions and DirectX 11 mode with the lowest settings preset with lens flares and film grain disabled. Given that Rise of the Tomb Raider can be pretty graphically intense, I was pretty surprised at just how well the 480 performed here. Both resolutions ran pretty smoothly at the start of the test, with 720p even managing to get over 80 FPS in the initial gunfight before getting into the Soviet installation. Even in the Soviet installation itself, performance is also fantastic. running pretty smoothly and dropping no lower than 50 FPS, or no lower than around 60 at 720p. This is usually an area where older cards can perform pretty badly, but given that the 480 was once the fastest single GPU card in the world, it obviously still has some grunt today. The same is true for the copper mill area as well, although at 1080p there was some possible micro stuttering in the most intense scenes, with lots of action and fire, with the FPS dropping into the low 40s, although it's only really noticeable when turning the camera. And 720p never had this issue at all. The benchmark for 1080p showed average 1% and 0.1% lows of 59, 39 and 29 FPS respectively, with a couple spikes in frame times around 40 milliseconds, a few more of 120 to 160 milliseconds, and one of 660 milliseconds. 720p obviously fared better, with average 1% and 0.1% lows of 95, 68 and 30 FPS respectively, with a couple spikes in frame times of around 65 to 100 milliseconds which weren't noticeable, so there's obviously plenty of room to up the settings a bit. Next up is onto Warframe, which, as you'll notice, I haven't bothered running at 720p, and that's because the performance at 1080 was fantastic already. I used a custom high graphics preset with X16 Anisotropic Filtering, and depth of field, motion blur and bloom disabled, and I'm running the benchmark in a survival mission on Jupiter. Throughout the mission I never noticed any stutter or locking up at all. The lowest the frame rate tended to get was around the 50 FPS mark, although in fire it could dip into the mid 30s, but other than that performance was fantastic. In the least detailed areas of the game, FPS could even get into the high 80s as well, although that's with no enemies around you at all. The benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% lows of 63, 45 and 41 FPS respectively, and only had one notable spike in frame times of 40 milliseconds. Csgo was another game that didn't require running at 720p either, and it was by far the best performing game in the test today. This has been run at 1080p with max settings and 8x MSAA enabled as well. The test is also being run in a hard difficulty competitive bot match on the Mirage map. As expected, there were no issues running Csgo whatsoever. Frame rates wouldn't drop any lower than the low 140s, and would even hit as high as the high 280s indoors. There were no issues with input lag or locking, and nor were there any issues with stuttering or locking up, which is pretty much all there is to say about this game considering nothing notable happened. The benchmark showed average 1% and 0.1% lows of 172, 101 and 95 FPS respectively, with multiple but completely unnoticeable spikes in frame times throughout the test of around 50 to 60 milliseconds. Now it's time for some overclocking fun on this utter volcano of a graphics card. I fixed the fan speed at 100% for the duration of the overclock tests to try and keep temperatures in check. I've also left out GTA 5 from the overclock tests due to the issues I talked about at the start of the video. With Rise of the Tomb Raider, the GTX 480 could manage clocks of 830 MHz on the core, resulting in a shader clock of 1660 MHz and a max stable memory clock of 1985 MHz. This was at stock voltage levels, as increases in voltage routinely had temperatures reaching or exceeding 100 degrees Celsius in games like Warframe. That aside, performance was pretty decent with the overclock. It already ran pretty smoothly at both resolutions at the start of the test, so there wasn't a particularly noticeable improvement there. But on the Soviet installation for example, 1080p could now maintain at least 60 FPS throughout, with 720p maintaining at least 90. There was still some possible micro stuttering at 1080p in the copper mill area, with FPS lows a bit higher but still dropping into the 40s. Again though, it was only really noticeable when turning the camera. 720p on the other hand tended to maintain over 100 FPS here, running pretty smoothly throughout and not dropping any lower than the high 80s FPS wise. Overall, there's plenty of space to up the settings at 720p, with 1080p offering pretty playable levels of performance as well. But that's completely disregarding the fact that the GTX 480's fan is at a speed that makes the noise levels more than uncomfortable for extended gameplay. The benchmark for 1080p showed average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 66, 44 and 30 FPS respectively, with one frame time spike of around 40 milliseconds, one of around 55 milliseconds and one of 80 milliseconds, showing that the overclock does make a pretty decent improvement over stock. 720p had average 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 107, 75 and 30 FPS respectively, with a few frame time spikes of around 40 to 50 milliseconds and one of 80 milliseconds. With Warframe, as you'll have seen, performance was already fairly decent, so an overclock wasn't really going to make any difference to playability at all. That said though, there was a pretty big improvement in FPS figures in the least detailed areas of the map, which could now get into the high 140s, although that's before the mission starts and is in the least detailed area of the map, so isn't particularly representative of the rest of the game. The game needed a drop in core and shader clock to 823 MHz and 1645 MHz respectively, but managed a slightly higher memory clock of 1998 MHz. Again, this is with stock voltage, as an increase in voltage would have the temperatures getting towards or exceeding 100 degrees Celsius. Throughout the mission, FPS would still dip into the low 50s, and much like its stock clocks, there weren't any issues with stuttering or locking up, nor were there issues with input locking or lag either. The benchmark showed average, 1% and 0.1% low frame rates of 73, 53 and 48 FPS respectively, with only one frame time spike of around 40 milliseconds. A reasonable improvement over stock clocks, but given stock's performance, it's not a particularly noticeable one. And lastly, we're finishing up with Csgo, which is another game that really doesn't need an overclock at all, but I went ahead with it anyway. This game managed the highest clocks of the test, with 839 MHz on the core, resulting in 1678 MHz on the shader, and the memory was able to manage 2123 MHz. Again, the performance is fantastic. FPS indoors was now hitting over 290 and wouldn't drop below the low 150s. And like stock, there were no signs of any kind of stuttering or locking up, and no input locking either. The average and 1% lows also shot up to 197 and 124 FPS respectively, with fairly similar 0.1% lows to stock clocks of 98 FPS. The frame time spikes were a bit better as well, with multiple occurring throughout of around 40 to 60 milliseconds, but far enough apart that they weren't noticeable at all.
So yeah, as you saw, the GTX 480 is actually still a pretty decent performer today, if you can put aside its issues with heat and the god-awful fan noise. But yeah, I was pretty annoyed I couldn't get GT5 running. I do have plans on trying it with older drivers to see if I can get it running, so I'll update you all if I do actually manage to get the game running. But Csgo and Warframe, I'm not particularly surprised they actually performed well, considering they're relatively easy games to run, and the 480, despite being 9 years old, was once, as I mentioned, the fastest single GPU card you could buy. But the biggest surprise for me anyway during this video, or during the test, was just how well Rise of the Tomb Raider performed. It can be pretty intense graphically, that game, and although I used the lowest settings on 1080p, it performed a lot better than I was imagining. And there's probably some room to even up the settings as well.
Before we finish up today, I'd like to give a special shout out to Patreon supporter TazFeDodge, or @TazFeDodge on Twitter, for making all of this possible. If you enjoyed this video, please consider leaving a comment and a like, and subscribing to my channel if you'd like to see more content like this, and maybe even sharing the video with people you think may enjoy it. And although there's no obligation to do so, you can support me in creating these videos from my Patreon at patreon.com/Benching&Gaming, or through Ko-fi at ko-fi.com/Benching&Gaming. And if you do decide to become a patron, for as little as $2 a month, you'll gain early access to all of my videos for as long as you remain a patron. But thanks for watching my video. It means a lot that you would take the time to watch my content. Hopefully I'll see you in the next one.